Hey, so welcome back to the Flow Tribe podcast, where I get to interview the movers, breathers, teachers, and healers of the world. So in this episode, I got to speak with Luis Guaman. Luis is a clarity coach, which means that he helps people to find purpose and clarity in their lives. We dove into all kinds of interesting ideas in this episode. We talked about his background, which involves leaving a very successful sales career to pursue this new career path. We also talked about some of the parallels between martial arts training and sales and business, which I thought was really interesting. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm pretty sure you will too. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Luis Guaman. So Luis, thank you so much for joining me today. I can't wait to get into this conversation with you. So why don't we start by having you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm excited, Patrick. Thanks for having me on. I am a clarity coach. I help entrepreneurs and leaders go from feeling stuck and overwhelmed to having clarity, building discipline and focus by creating new habits. And my story, really, it begins in sales. Well, actually, it begins a little bit before that because it begins about me sucking at public speaking and being able to express my thoughts and feelings. And that was all throughout high school. I was the kid who was just not able to stand in front of the class and speak his mind. And it was never because I didn't like people, but it was more so because I just wasn't skilled at it. So after college, I got involved with sales. And I knew it was a skill that I wanted to have because I wanted to communicate with people. I have been a martial artist my entire life, and I've always loved people. I've always loved business, but to really make a difference, to make results happen, I just didn't know how to do that. That's why I got involved with sales, after reading different books like Robert Kiyosaki and Zig Ziglar and things of that nature. So I got involved with that. So I went from bad to good, the good to great, and great to a top performer. And I opened up a sales company. And it was a direct sales company. The kind of sales I was doing was door-to-door sales. So I sold things like copy paper. I sold office supplies. I've done charity. I've done energy. And most of my career in direct sales, it was selling Verizon Fios. It was actually selling Verizon services to the people of New York City. So speaking to every kind of person. And I did that for a few years. Now, for me, a tough time really came when I made the transition actually to go into mostly coaching, was because during my career as a sales manager, at the highest point in that career, it was about 2 years into my company, and things were going really well. I was making a good amount of money. I was managing several people, a team of people, about 30 people. Paid off this credit card I had, $10,000 credit card, paid it off in a month, and had a lot of things coming in. And I had this specific memory of how I was sitting in my office and just staring out one day, and I was alone. And I had this notion that came over me of unfulfillment, of something was wrong. And since I've been a martial artist my whole life, thankfully, I know this notion of meditation or just, okay, let's calm down. So I did that for about a week. I said, okay, let's calm down and see what's going on. Because you have all this going on, this money going on, you have these people that you have going on running around, and things are supposed to be good. And the fact is they weren't. So after I did this reflection, I came, or rather remembered, on how, you know what, I'm here at this place in my life, but I don't really care too much about monetary value. I don't care too much about being the person in charge. And I had both of those things. And so I realized that I didn't have any grander goals, and that I was at this place in my life. That was a good place. I was at this place in my life because of by my own volition, or rather not by my own ideals, but because of what I thought my parents would want me to be at, or where I thought my managers and my mentors would want me to be at. So it's basically outward coming in. It's like I was in a place where I thought other people thought that I should be at. And that's a recipe for self-sabotage. And that's exactly what happened. When I had this realization, I became incredibly unclear. And I went on a mental decline, so much so by the end of the third year, I closed my company down and I left. I made sure everybody was all right, and they were. And I closed my company down with a debt of about $25,000 in total and just no idea of what I should do. And I do not recommend it for anybody. You should kind of know, you should transition with a plan in mind. But I felt so trapped and it was so just hard hitting to my soul. I felt like I was in the middle of the water, just without anywhere to grab. And that's kind of what happened. And the reason, and I realized later on that the reason why that happened was because I just didn't have a proper vision. I didn't have proper clarity for myself. I didn't take myself, you could say, take myself seriously enough to focus on myself. When I had this realization of just, okay, you know what, things are off. I went and buried myself in my work too much, which was a big mistake. I ignored myself. And so after closing my company, instead of having some of my friends, because they say, okay, Lewis, you know how to run a team of people now, or you're so great at communicating now, or rather you have this experience in sales. So instead of going to this 80K job and some people saying, okay, you know what, we go to finance, we get something 100K, we could, any kind of job, I politely said, no, no thanks. And what I did is I went to go work in a restaurant as a barback. And I did that because I didn't want to just repeat the cycle. I knew by me making more money, it's not going to really help the problem. It's not going to solve the issue, the core issue of me being unfulfilled or not knowing what to do. And so I worked in a restaurant because I wanted to work in a place where, sure, nobody knew me or I wasn't in charge of anybody. It was my equivalent of just going into the mountains and just doing my own thing and working on myself. So while I was working there at that restaurant, just to make ends meet, just to have some money coming in, to pay for rent, I would just read books and I would look at YouTube videos and talk to some people online and try to reach out for some different perspective. And I did that for a while. And I spent about 2 years from after closing my company down, combining the experiences that I've had in leadership, in self-development, and the lifetime of martial arts experience to develop a method and structure that to help myself of how to create clarity of what I was looking for, but also how to create the path of how to accomplish it and how to get yourself back on the path after getting knocked off. And that's essentially what I teach other people now. That's what I help entrepreneurs and leaders and team leaders do now. Because if I had that knowledge of, you know what, okay, something's wrong. Okay, well, instead of ignoring it, okay, what are we going to do about it? How do we go deeper in ourselves? How do we have this kind of self-mastery? That's something I really love to drive home, of just self-mastery. How do we get deeper in ourselves and have a structure that we can follow where, you know what, almost like a checklist, but a framework where you can come back even if you get knocked off your path, because we always do. And what I mean by path is, okay, you know what, we're not in our zone anymore. Or you know what, I'm just not feeling this work. You know, I'm super unmotivated. You know what, I'm overwhelmed. I'm not this whole notion of what people feel through ambition. And this is not just through business, but anyone with ambition, we get knocked off. How do we hop back on our path? That's what I needed desperately. And it took me a while. And so, like I said, that's why I culminated the experiences that I've had, throughout life and what I was learning to create this framework. And that's why today I'm passionate about helping entrepreneurs and leaders stop feeling stuck and start creating clarity, discipline, and focus without the same pain and struggles that I went through. So that's me in a nutshell.
Okay, there's a few things I'd like to unpack there. The first thing is the fact that because I think a lot of people are in that same situation where they're making good money, they have a good job, they have a company, they have people working for them, they check all those boxes that should leave them fulfilled, but they're not. And I think the difference sometimes between some people and others is there's people who are in that situation, have that feeling like something's not right, but kind of ignore it. And they just assume this is as good as it gets. Therefore, who am I to be unhappy? And they just accept their fate, right? They accept the situation they're in and they go on to be, maybe they find some happiness at some point, or maybe they just live with this lack of something more. And then there's people like you who recognize that this isn't everything. There's some boxes left to check. Right? And these boxes aren't enough. The money wasn't enough. The being in charge wasn't enough. and you were willing to take that risk, because it is a risk. It's a huge risk. And I think that's just the rule of entrepreneurship is, are you willing to take risks? And if the answer is no, don't be an entrepreneur.
Right.
Take the safe route, because there's so much risk involved. There's so much stress involved. There's the unknown that you have to be willing to navigate. That's so important. And
Mm-hmm.
then I also love that you were willing to take a job as a barback, which for a lot of people would be completely ridiculous. Like, why? Almost like a demotion, right? Almost like a huge step backwards. But you didn't see it as, look, I'm not looking to start a career as a barback. I just recognize that I need space right now.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just would have jumped into some finance job or something else, you never would have had clarity. You never would have had that opportunity to reset mentally and
Mm-hmm.
figure out, what do those next steps look like. And I think the lesson there is sometimes you need to be willing to take on a job as a barback, or as you name it,
Mm-hmm.
just something simple, mindless almost,
Mm-hmm.
that, yeah, and it almost gives you that kind of freedom to think, right? And that freedom, like, I think that's what's cool sometimes about just engaging in any type of manual labor,
Yep.
is it's just pure physical work that leaves your mind kind of open for thought, for processing, for things happening even subconsciously,
Right.
because you're not super stimulated mentally, which allows you to explore all of these different things.
Right.
So yeah, so I think that's amazing. So something you mentioned was, and this is where we can kind of segue, is you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned how you were a martial artist for most of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that there's a lot, in the conversation we had previously about this, we kind of started to draw a lot of parallels
Mm-hmm.
about how you can take some of these martial arts, principles of martial arts, and apply them to the real world, right? The world
Mm-hmm.
of business, the world of, you name it, the world of performance in general.
Right.
So I'd love to dive into that a little bit. And so maybe to be more specific, could you talk a little bit about your martial arts journey? Like, really keep it short. I don't want this to be about the martial arts journey, just to
Sure.
give people a little bit of context. And then what would you say is the first lesson, or maybe how do you feel like your martial arts training helped you make this transition from where you were to where you are now?
Sure. Okay. I'm excited to speak about that. Um, it is one of my biggest passions in life. I started martial arts when I was in third grade. That was about 8 years old. I did karate for a few years. Then closer to college, I did taekwondo. So we did that. I did that for 5 years. After that, I did Wing Chun as for 2 years. And a few years after that, I did Brazilian Jiu Jitsu for 1 year. And am currently studying Muay Thai. And I'm not really a proponent for just saying hop into different martial arts, but and with different teachers, just for what happened with me is just through different life instances. I had to move schools, things had to happen, and I had an open mind to want to try different things, and that's how it happened. There's so much I could talk about for the parallels of martial arts and business, but for your question of how it helped me with this transition specifically, the notion of the battle that's always going on. I think that's the first time I verbalized that. It's the battle that's always going on. When throughout my martial arts journey, I've always learned, of course, physically, okay, we have opponents that are similar stature, that are bigger, that weigh more, that weigh less. And what we do is we try to defeat them, right, in a controlled environment. And how we relate that concept is to life. There's always going to be things that happen. That's really things you could handle, things that are bigger that you don't think you can handle, or things that, you know what, you could take on very easily. But how we live in these times that are, you could call it, much more peaceful than just war times of hundreds of years ago, there's always still something that you're battling with. And a lot of the time, that's an internal battle, sometimes an internal struggle that happens. And how it really relates to the transition is that, okay, I'm going through this battle of, I have this opportunity in front of me, but I don't see the value in it anymore for me as a human. So what is this saying? What am I relating it to? Am I relating this struggle of my business to what's happening? Am I taking that more important as to compared to who I am as a person? That's really what it did. What did it for me? What I am was a sales manager, and I was managing these people. I was a person, a human making X amount of money, right? And at the highest point, I was making over 4,000 a week in profit, and that was fun, right? But that was never really money motivated, driven. That's what I was. But for who I was as a person, right? It's not really the same thing. And throughout my entire martial arts journey, it's just reinforced that. So when I'm making this transition, really in that cutting line of just, you know what? Okay, you could build your company up again. It's yours. Just do it. You could get better at it. Okay, yeah, I can. Or do you take this bet on you? What are you betting on? Are you betting on the what you are? Or are you going to bet on who you are? And that's getting me fired up right now. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, so it's the fighting mentality, right? That willingness to fight and fight for what you believe in, fight for what it is you want out of life, fight for your goals. And I think also recognizing that you're capable of more. I think that for me, a big, big part of martial arts training, especially if you're really, I think there's different levels of martial arts training, right? There's showing up to class every day, but then there's sparring and then there's fighting and, there's different levels. And it's not to say that you need to go to that highest level in order to get the benefits.
Mm-hmm.
What I think martial arts teaches you is adversity and how to overcome it. It's like you said, when you go up against someone who's bigger, who's stronger, who's more talented than you,
Mm-hmm.
and you are humbled in defeat, right? But you're also humbled in victory because you recognize how hard it was to get there, right? The thing with any type of, whether it's a sport, whether it's a skill,
Mm-hmm.
there's a certain amount of work that's required to achieve what it is you're setting out to achieve. And so
Right.
you don't get to, unless you're, extremely gifted and whatever, for most people walking into that martial arts gym the first time is extremely humbling. But once you go through it and once you start to see that progress, you recognize that you're so much more capable of than what you thought you were.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that once you've had that lesson taught to you through the physical components of martial arts, it does something to you. It empowers you. And suddenly when you're faced with those difficult challenges in your life, you're more inclined to go after it. Your fighter's mentality has been awakened, and that's going to help you in so many different ways. So I'd like to bring up some of the points you made here in these notes you sent me. The one that I love is the first one, which is the difference between nervousness and excitement. And I think that, what I teach is I really believe in how we can use stress as a positive thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Stress, anxiety, these are all just emotions, not even emotions. I think they're basically neurochemical reactions that are triggered by a stressor, by a struggle, by the thought of what could happen,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that nervousness that's created is usually a sign, right? It's a sign that something exciting is about to happen. It's a sign that
Mhm.
something important is happening or could happen in the future or will happen.
Mhm.
And so how we navigate that nervousness, that excitement, that's going to have such a huge impact on the outcome of what happens next.
Yes.
So what lessons can you share, or, what have you experienced in your life, like making that move that
Mhm.
you just made? I think that's such an important thing to understand is if you're not nervous, chances are you're not going big enough. You're not trying hard enough, right? If it's too
Right.
easy, it's like, okay, this is too easy. You won't be
Boring.
fulfilled. You won't be fulfilled. There's no way, right? Unless you're just someone who doesn't want to challenge themselves, which is fine, to each their own. But if you are, like, it's that nervousness that gets you. It's like, okay, here we go. And, you might fail and it might hurt, but I think that the more times you throw yourself in there and take that on, the easier it gets. And at some point, once you achieve it, oh my God, the win is so much better because it was hard, right? So what lessons have you brought from that?
Totally true. First thing that comes to mind is how I mentioned that I was terrible at public speaking. And I think that's something a lot of people can relate to, of just voicing their opinions, just expressing themselves. They get nervous. They get shaky. They start sweating a little bit. This is exactly what I'm talking about. So the difference between being excited and nervous, just like you stated, they are physiologically the same thing. The big difference is the meaning that you put behind it. So as I got more experienced and several years later, when I started running sales meetings or just meetings in my company, then in front of X amount of people, 5 people, 10 people, 20 people, then I would do conferences, 200 people. That same feeling was there, but I gave a very different meaning to it. So instead of being apprehensive and saying, okay, something might go wrong, it's more so of, I have this energy. Where am I going to push it? Where am I going to direct it? much like in martial arts, when you're in the heat of battle and you're sparring, you need to be able to do something, and that's energy flowing in a certain direction, and that's at a direction that you choose. So it's the same thing of when you're dealing with, okay, I have this thing that I'm doing, let's say a presentation, then I have this thing. Am I going to curl up, if you want to take the fighting mentality or metaphor? Am I going to curl up and defend, or am I going to use this energy to attack? And so I made the decision to use the energy to attack, to say, okay, this is going to be the best presentation, the best kind of notion of how I'm going to get my point across ever. And that's that. Another example that comes up is when I was working recently, what I think it was about a month ago, with one of my clients, Chris. He's a world champion beatboxer. And he was telling me that even though he's done a million shows, he still gets this notion of right before he's going to go and perform. He loves to perform. He loves to create music. He even produces music. But he had this feeling of just, I'm going to die before he goes and performs. It's like, okay, Lewis, like, I really get pent up for it. I don't know what. So what we did is I coached him through it. And now that meaning, we changed the meaning of it. So instead of I'm going to die right before I have this feeling, we made the connection. And literally the metaphor was similar of the warrior's mentality of before we go into battle, are we thinking about how we're going to die? No, we acknowledge that it exists, right? You can lose this battle without being so dramatic. You can lose the battle in business too, right? But when we go in, instead of saying that we're just going to be scared, we're going to use this energy to, you know what? Okay, this is the feeling that we get knowing before the battle starts. But I know, because I've won this battle so many times before, that this is just me being fired up to go kill it. And that's what he started doing. Totally changed his game. And then those are two examples right there.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that another important thing to remember as a lesson is it's great to get fired up. And this applies to fighting extremely well also. It's great to get fired up. But if you go too far in that direction, you're going to exhaust yourself very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think back to my first ever Muay Thai fight, or even some of the first sparring sessions I had, where that intensity becomes so overwhelming that you burn out so quickly, right? It's like this adrenaline rush, and then you crash. And then you basically lose control over everything, and it does not go well. So what you have to learn is that slow burn, right? It's so you have that pent up energy, that nervous energy, that is a good thing. That's fuel, right? It's fuel. But if you use up all that fuel at once, if you go out, let's say you're public speaking, go out on stage, and you're like, what's up? You know, and you're like super pumped and you're almost shaking with anticipation,
Right.
You're not going to last, right? You can't deliver something smart and focused in that state. So what you have to learn to do is to channel that energy, right? You have to learn to take that nervous energy and kind of channel it into this kind of calm intensity, is the word I like to use. And this calm intensity where, yes, the intensity and the focus is there, but you're delivering in a smart, calm way that makes it very easy for people to connect with what you're doing or what you're saying. And the same thing applies to fighting, is be intense, be ready for anything, but be very strategic, right? And be very methodical and be very technical. And that's how you're able to perform at your best, is when you can combine those two things. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Okay, so another great point you have here is confidence and humility. Yep. And I think that's something that comes up a lot, both in business and in the fight game and many aspects of performance in life, is a thin line. It's a thin line between being cocky and being confident. And I think that sometimes confidence can come off in the wrong way. And I think that's normal, especially if you don't have any humility, right? I think it's important I think very much like calm intensity, a confident humility is kind of like that sweet spot where you want to fall, where, yes, I'm a very confident person because I know that I've invested a great deal of work into becoming confident, but I also recognize that I respect the people I work with. I respect my opponent, if we're talking about the fight game. And that's where the humility comes from, right? That I don't need to show off. I don't need to say more than I need to say. So what examples have you found in your own life or with some of the people you work with where that, you know, that combination of confidence and humility has come up?
Yeah, tons. So this really comes really familiar in terms of either leadership or team management, or not even just team management, just being involved with the team, you're there to provide value and create results, right? Whether you're the manager or whether you're just a person part of the team. And what you want to do is do those results. And people want to work with people who are confident, who are positive, who have a good outlook on things. When things get a little bit too heavy is when people are a little bit overzealous by over shouting themselves, over promising and under delivering, you could say. Really, it's I can do this, or I can do this, and because I just can handle it, or you know what, don't worry about it. When people see that you're the person who is kind of forcibly taking control of things and not kind of just spreading the work, or just trying to put in the notion of just when you're just being very singular, when you're being mainly about you. I think that's where I'm trying to get at. That's where people become very unattracted. They don't really want to work with you. They don't want you touching their work. They don't want to come to you when they need help. This cascades into a lot of things about, let's say, communication also. They don't want to start communicating with you because they think that you are all about you. And it's just a whole bunch of negative aspects that just start cascading on into different aspects of business and personal life. So like you said, what was it? The middle ground, confident humility, having a balance. I'm very big on balance. So having a balance of knowing that I'm good at this, and you know what? I'm not so good, or not as good as that. And just being able to express both of those points goes a very long way to having people not hate you. I say that because I remember, I'm not going to put them on the spot, but people I've trained before or people I've worked with, they were so, not to me, I've always, been very open with people. I love people, but other people would make it a point to not work with them, to not go to them, to not do anything with them because they just didn't like them, right? Because they seem too cocky, they seem too confident. But when you start showing a bit of vulnerability, I like to call it when you show your, not subjects, well, you could say it that way. If you're a manager and you show your people that kings or queens can bleed, that's how I think about it. The people will see you more so as a human. That always goes a long way. So when you show a bit of vulnerability, someone in a management position, instead of just do this, or they're so scared because they don't want to seem like they're vulnerable. If you show that, you show further strength and you show further camaraderie, and then you have people opening up on both sides, and you get more people confident in you, more confident in the team. There's a whole bunch of positive cascades that happen, and that's really how it works.
Yeah, so two things I extract from that are that, one, a good leader is willing to allow the people that they lead to take all the credit, right? Like if I'm a good leader, my goal is to build up my team and to allow my team to shine. And the humility comes in the fact that I'm willing to let them shine while I just kind of maybe sit in the background and not take credit for everything, and be willing to allow other people to be at the front of this thing. Yeah. And something that I thought about as you were talking that struck me, especially about the fight game, if you're talking about confidence, is when I was, I've trained a lot of MMA fighters, and I've trained, and I've done quite a bit of sparring and fighting myself. For me, the opponent that scared me more. So if there was someone in front of me that was like looking mean and huffing and puffing, and to me right away, that demonstrated a lack of confidence, because this person was pretending to be tough or pretending to be meaner than they were because they weren't necessarily confident in their abilities. The opponent that scared me way more was the person who didn't seem to care, who was just looking at me like, whatever, and I remember there was this one guy one day, he showed up at our gym and he just had this little duffel bag, and he worked on, his name was Corey, and he worked on ships. I was in Montreal, Canada, and he worked on ships that would go through the St. Lawrence River. And he worked on this ship, and he was in town for like a month while the ship was being repaired or something like that. Anyway, he walks in and he just had this super easygoing way about him. And he had like these old boxing gloves, and his equipment was falling apart, and he didn't look, he's a big tough guy, but he didn't look the part at all. And he's like, hey man, I think I could jump in with you guys. And he's super humble. And he just, man, he was a machine. But and it was the way he looked at us. Like he just looked at you like you're just another piece of meat for me to deal with. And I still remember, and he was one of my toughest sparring partners because of that, because he just had this confidence. And then I found out later on that when he was home in Atlantic, Canada, he worked in this bar where he was a bouncer. But this bar was where a lot of the men who worked on the oil rigs out in the ocean would come to unwind on weekends. So I'm like, this guy spends his weekends bouncing oil riggers. I'm pretty sure getting into a boxing ring with people with equipment on doesn't bother him too much, right? So anyway, all that to say that if you're really confident in what you do, you don't need to talk about what you do. You don't need to talk about how confident you are. It will show in your actions. It will show in the way that you carry yourself. It will show in your results. The more you need to sell yourself, it probably means that there's something missing in what, you know. And then I think if you're at that point, then it's like, hey, go do more work, personal work, so that you no longer need to sell yourself in that way.
Right.
Does that make sense to you?
Right. No, absolutely. You know what that really, he's a personification of somebody who let go, who lets go. I believe this guy, Corey, so he let go of, okay, I don't need to show up and be pretentious and show people what I am. I just need to be. That is one of the pillars of being a martial artist. And also from what you've stated, that reminds me of the inverse. So what if you're somebody who is too humble, right? Instead of being overly confident, you're too humble. And then you're not saying enough. You're not standing up for yourself enough. You're not doing enough. Not necessarily just for the team, because this is one of the mistakes I made, right? Other people, your team, your family, sure, it's super important. But where's you, right? Like where's the action for you? Where's the methodology and the framework and everything for your mentality? And so do you know how far you can go? First of all, do you want that? So if you want that, then a whole new slew of just opportunity opens up. So, okay, then now we want it. So now what do we need to do? So if you are not willing to even step into that confidence, stepping into your own power, which is something I believe even both of us work with our respective clients, that's something that you start pushing into the next power, or you could say level of your life. Who's to say that we can't be the Corey level, right? We can be. I 100%, but is that where our focus is? So that's coming from the inverse as well.
Yeah, and I think what you're kind of starting to touch on is this idea of flow, right? And so I completely agree that yes, you want to be humble, but sometimes too much humility can lead to a lack of confidence, right? Where you're not allowing yourself to be confident because you're afraid you'll come off as arrogant, you'll come off as cocky. But that's the other trap, right? Is I've seen people, like I've seen incredible fighters, very technical fighters, just not be able to turn it on. Right. There's a switch, you know, in the fight game, there's this, like we talk about this switch where you go from thinking about what you're doing to just going. And that's flow. That's flow. That's in any sport. That's in any type of high level performance, is tapping into that flow state where you are no longer thinking about what you're doing. You're just running on pure instinct. But those instincts must be trained, right? You don't get to step into a ring without ever having practiced and suddenly shine. The reason you're able to go into flow, and this applies to anything, is because you've invested the time to be great at what you do. Or, you know, in some cases you just have a natural talent, but even then some people they'll self-sabotage and not allow that talent, that potential to come through because they overthink things, because stress and fear get in their way, right? And so what lessons would you say you've learned in that regard, in ways of kind of getting out of your own way and allowing that potential to come through? Because I think what you're talking about, clarity, right, and coaching for clarity, in order to achieve that level of clarity, you need to be in that peak state. You need to be in that state where, okay, now I'm in that best version of me. This is the best version of me. And this is where I need to be making decisions. Because if I'm making decisions from a place of doubt or fear, I won't make the best decisions for myself. Right. And in the same way that if I'm overconfident or almost arrogant, I may make decisions that don't actually connect to my actual level of competency. Right. So you have to find that sweet spot, which I think is flow. So where do you find Well, how do you connect to those ideas?
I would say not needing to be necessarily at the peak, but definitely being at a balanced state where you can definitely be in flow as long as you're balanced, but stepping into your power. You're stepping into the unknown. You're stepping into the discomfort, right? Which is what we do on a regular basis, with the study of martial arts. And so what we need to do is stop everything. When you're really trying to find flow and when you're trying to create clarity and trying to discover it, you stop doing everything and you sit down and you shut up and you do deep work. Because like you said a few minutes ago, you keep working on yourself, but it's good to have people like us, you could say, kind of guiding people through. But we start letting go of the things that are unnecessary and we start focusing on the things that are necessary. That's a whole other conversation. But what you do is you find what is important to you. And part of really the process is just that more questions. More questions are usually the answers. That's what they are, more questions. So, okay, I'm super overwhelmed right now, or really I don't know what I should be doing. Okay, well, why do you want to do this? Why do you want to find that out? What would make you happy? Well, are you not happy now? Well, what would happen if you had everything? A series of questions. I'll go more and more as to how you would coach someone. And that's what I would do with myself. And that's really one of the biggest mistakes that I made before my transition. I just stopped doing that for myself. I stopped caring enough to put time, maybe half an hour a week for myself to just take care of me, ask myself those questions. And I didn't have that framework that I do now. And I let myself fall apart. I self-sabotage myself. But that's how you start to create that clarity. You take time for yourself. You create space and time. You start letting go of things, which all this is practice, and then you start diving deep as to the points, the the center point of just kind of what is it that you want, and then the layers that go on top of that. That's really how it's found.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to first of all create that space, right? Like when you're in it, it's really hard to have that clarity because you're too focused on everything that's going on around you. You're too focused on where you're going, right? But when you're able to take a little step off the path and sit, and and whether that's through meditation or even, like I said, a moving meditation, which is in many ways what martial arts is, or for some people it's gardening, for some people it's going for a hike, for some people it's doing something that allows your mind to just exist on its own without having to focus on what you're actually doing in the moment, right? So whether that's sitting in quiet or taking a hike, like I said, or just doing something that gives you an opportunity to be clear. Because if you don't create that space, it's going to be really hard for that clarity to come to you. The other thing I wanted to mention earlier, and that I just wanted to shine some light on, is the fact that you've been there, right? And I think as coaches, it's so important to speak from personal experience. I think what's difficult for me sometimes is when I come up on someone who is talking from case studies, who's talking from what they've read in books, or they're using other people's experiences as examples. And it's not to say that there's no value in that. I think there's a lot we can learn from other people's experiences and knowledge that's shared in books and psychology, and there's a lot of stuff going on there. But when you speak from personal experience, right? So if I'm someone who's stuck in a job that I don't like and I want to make this move to the next step, and if I'm speaking to someone like you who's been there, done that, and who can speak not only from acquired knowledge, but also from personal experience, that's, for me, I'm going to have more confidence in that than someone who says, yeah, I read this great book about people doing exactly what you did, so let me help you. It's like, you read a book? Okay, I'll just buy the book. It's going to be a hell of a lot cheaper than hiring you, right? So, so how else do you feel like your own personal experiences have helped you now help other people?
You could bring me back for another episode if you want. I could talk forever on this. Like, it fires me up so much. I mean, just so much. I genuinely care. When I was closing my company, I started it because I had it just for about 3 years. And so when I started it, one of my best friends, he started his own company doing something completely different. And we've known each other for a long time. And so when I closed my company that month, I was speaking to him, he's still is and was one of my best friends. And he tells me how his company made over 150K or so, or doubled in size, that month when I closed mine. And so how for everyone, listening, how would you feel if something like that happens, right? If you're not a bad person and you're trying to figure things out, and what you're working so hard and just fails. And the fact is that, and it's your fault, right? You got to take responsibility. It was my fault. And you have one of your best friends right there in front of you. People are growing right next to you, right? Now, for me personally, I have a few friends like that, and I love them for it. I'm not someone who's vindictive or just someone who's petty or anything like that, but it still hurts a little bit. You still have ego. Why is this happening to me? And so I say that because of the example that you gave before for leadership, or rather of just how does this really relate, right? In terms of what you do on a regular basis. If I'm that person who on my own, let's say, is studying martial arts, who I am this person, I'm this warrior in this dojo or dojang or wherever you study in the ring, are you still that same person outside of the ring? Right? If you're a specific kind of leader, right? I'm always a person who's lead by example, who's okay, go first, let the other people follow, or be with your people. Am I that person everywhere? Are you that person everywhere? I am that person everywhere. At that time, it was really hard. It's really difficult because I'm not someone who's really influenced too much about other people are doing this, other people are doing that. It was just really hard for a lot of other reasons we have not gone into yet. But for the people who is a leader, or they want to be a leader, or there's someone who's in charge of anything, or you're in a specific kind of sport, because you put a belt on, or because you put on a certain uniform, or because you put in a suit, which is a uniform, that does not create the essence of who you are. Who you are is that person that you decide to be, who you act as, your habits that you do on a regular basis, your mentality, who you show up as. That's who you are. Now just ask the question, are you that person throughout most of your life? And so for me, I had to remember that and drive that in myself again. And that was just really hard. And I could talk in a different part about that. But I had to go through that again for myself, or rather not again, but in a different way. And remind myself again and again that I am that person. I can go through this. I can overcome this. And that's what it was. And so that reminds me of when I was teaching my people to moving into a leadership position or becoming better salespeople or whatnot. It's the same thing for them. And that cascades on and on. So.
Yeah, it's just basically being able to come back and also, again, back to humility, admitting to mistakes.
Yeah.
Right. And being, as a leader, being willing to say, hey guys, guess what? I screwed up.
Mm-hmm.
And here's how we're going to fix it. Or here's how I'm going to fix it. Right. This isn't on you. This is on me. Or taking responsibility, even for the mistakes of others.
Yep.
Right. Having that humility and saying, you know what, if you failed, it's because I failed you. I think that to me is leadership on a whole other level, is when you have a leader who's not only willing to take responsibility for their own mistakes, but even take on the mistakes of the people they've been leading. Right. And I think that having gone through it yourself, living off, using your own personal experiences in a coaching facility is just, I think, the signs of a good coach or a good leader. Because in the end, a coach is a leader, right? A coach is leading people to something better. That's what coaching is. And I think there's so many, whether it's in sports, whether it's in business, you name it, there's so many examples of, those that lead by example and those that lead in a different way. I think there's a great, I think it's a meme or an illustration where you have, the leader in the front pulling, or you have the boss in the back whipping the people to pull him. Right. And that's just, it's a perfect example though. Right. And if someone fails, to be too quick to blame that person, or, hey, wait, is it my fault? Maybe there's something that I wasn't fulfilling. Maybe there's a piece of this that I should take responsibility for. I think that's really important. So are there more lessons you can draw from either martial arts or just your experiences that you are now feel more comfortable with at this point in your life that maybe a few years ago you were like, you weren't there yet, and things that you're now able to help others deal with as well?
I feel like the articulation of exactly how what I've learned through martial arts and what I continue to study through it, how that really relates to the business world and what people go through on the regular day-to-day basis, work-life balance, what I feel like I'm much more comfortable at doing that now, the articulation. And I've just been living it for so many years, you know? That's what I would teach in my old company. I wouldn't use martial arts terms or tactics, but I would teach that. If we were talking about, let's say, I remember in my notes, I have generating, let's say, power, and like, how do you do that within martial arts, right? There's a lot of, it's like a whole hours you could talk about that. There's things that you do mentally, physically, movement, little things that are millimeters apart which generate force. And then how did we could go with that, how did I apply that to business when I first got into it? Okay, well, I knew that if I wanted to communicate a certain way, right? And we could talk about, let's say, communication and breath work, which you're incredibly familiar with, of how am I coming off? Is it too strong? Do I need to shout at someone to get myself across? Or do I need to look bigger than I am so then people could absorb me as someone who's authority? No, that's a little bit related towards what we were saying before. You don't need to be overzealously pushing yourself as you are in charge. That's even, if you were to look at it very clearly, it's a form of weakness, really. But if you're somebody who's able to, let's say, generate the power of, we could even say influence, because that's what I used to teach a lot too, for influencing in terms of sales. It's not something that you overwhelm someone with. It's something that you, just like power, and we would say like more so Eastern philosophy, but all martial arts, it flows from one end to the other, and really the other person receives it. And how you intend them to receive it, well, that depends on the dance that you do. The breath work, the communication, the talking between back and forth, the understanding, all of that is really from what I've learned from martial arts. And that is really what I've talked about for years when it comes to communicating and understanding each other, not just in a business aspect, but rather in a personal one-on-one, look, this is a human, how do I better understand this person? It's a dance back and forth.
Yeah, it's an exchange of energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whether you're talking sales, whether you're talking leadership, whether you're talking coaching,
Mm-hmm.
I think in the end, it's communication between two people or even you and a group of people. And it's about the energy exchange between those people. And, not to get metaphysical, but, energy has a weight to it. And if you're speaking from a place of truth and a place of authenticity, that message will be delivered in a very different way than if you're bullshitting.
Right.
And I think we see that a lot and especially in sales, I think especially now, I think because of the level of communication that exists in society now, through all the social media, and especially now, post or during this pandemic, where everything is happening online, everything is happening digitally. It's so easy to kind of figure out what's real and what's not, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're bullshitting, if you're making stuff up, if it's just so transparent, or at least for most people it is. I mean, there's still people who get fooled and all that. But I just think that we're at a point now where if you're not being truthful, it's going to come out. You're not going to succeed as a coach, as a salesperson, as whatever. I'll give a really quick example where, since I've been, gone back to coaching after taking some time off,
right,
it's incredible how many messages I'm getting from like the coaches of coaches or people who are looking to sell me to help me build my business. Some of it's authentic. I'm part of this amazing business group boot camp right now that these people are absolutely incredible. And they've helped me tremendously with a lot of my stuff. They've become mentors to me. But then there's just these like obvious messages of just like, come on, man, like, does this work? And I guess it does if they're successful. But to me, it's just like, maybe it's the martial arts training. Maybe it's the years of meditation where I can there's almost like an energy behind that message. It's like, it's a LinkedIn message. There shouldn't be an energy, but I feel it. I can almost tell like, yeah, no, this isn't for real. Just of the way it's worded, just the way there's something about it that, like, if I met that person in person right away, I'm sure I would feel it. right?
Yeah.
Even now through the screen, through these messaging apps, you can almost tell what's real and what's not, right? And so I just thank you for sharing what you've shared today. It's been very authentic. I love that you come from a place of truth, a place of experience, right? You've been through it. You were successful. Recognized that that success wasn't what you were looking for. Was willing to take a risk, willing to demean yourself with a job as a barback, right? And then go on and help others to find clarity for themselves. So I just want to commend you for that. And so just to wrap this up, because we're coming up on time, how can people connect with you, and what is some of do you have anything coming up that you'd like to share? Or if there's anything that you would like to share at this point, please go ahead.
Sure. If anyone would like to get in contact with me, you can reach me at my Instagram. The handle is Louis Guaman Official.
Awesome. So thanks again. I'll make sure to have all the links so people can connect with you in the notes for this episode. And again, thanks again for taking the time to speak with me, and I look forward to connecting with you in the future.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me, Patrick.